All right, everyone. So for this one, we are going to be looking at Freud's psychosexual stages. Now, the thing with Freud is, and we'll talk more about this a little later, but the thing with Freud is Freud was so right about so much. We have more or less accepted his ideas and have integrated them into our understandings of human nature and psychology and all that other good stuff. To the point that the only thing we really have left to argue with are the things that were either A, he missed the boat, or B, he described things in ways that we would not describe them today. I know it sounds a little weird, but you got to kind of understand where Freud is coming from. Because Freud is coming from the late 1800, early 1900 time frame. A lot of what we consider normal is still kind of cutting edge or seen as crazy sci-fi stuff. Like, for example, they don't even really have germ theory at this time. Like, germ theory is there, but it hasn't really gone fully mainstream yet, and that's a bit of an aside. Um, I don't know if you want to go into germ theory and stuff like that, but yeah. So kind of keep that in mind because Freud was kind of on the frontier uh, for his time, and for us, it was pretty much, yeah, okay, it's explored and we understand that. So, first, kind of a warning about Freud, and this is something that I always kind of talk about a little bit, is he is very controversial even today in the realm of psychology, and many critics have more or less built their career around disputing Freud. Um, Now, what happens is many people they miss the point of what he was trying to say, or they become fixated on some of the more extreme words used in his descriptions. And needless to say, a little bit of maturity is required, or in essence, you're going to kind of miss where Freud was, where he was going, and what he was trying to convey. So, first off, to just kind of get all this started, and I'm only scratching the tiniest bit of the surface on this one. By no means am I going in depth. Because if I was to do that, we'd be here for a couple weeks and you'd probably get bored with me eventually. But anyway, Freud believed that ultimately life is built around tension and pleasure. Now, I will come back to Freud later, but really, kind of the verbiage of this is the id and the superego. And the id is pretty much the part of ourself that is obsessed with meeting its needs, deriving pleasure, stuff like that. And then our superego is pretty much our moral compass. What we need, what we feel like we need to do based on what society says, our responsibilities, and all that other good stuff. But anyway, what happens is really this. To Freud, pretty much tension, and today we would almost call this anxiety, is a buildup of what he called sexual energy, um, also called the libido. Now, here's the thing. To Freud, sexual did not mean sexual within the connotation that we would normally describe it. To Freud, anything sexual was pleasurable. So, eating a piece of pie would be a sexual experience. Not because we're getting our rocks off on it, but because we are, deriving pleasure from eating that wonderful piece of pie. No, I won't pie. But with Freud is really about this. There are five stages that are there are five stages that are crucial to the development of an adult personality, and each stage uh, is in essence a conflict. And even kind of the way they describe a conflict, it's not really a good way to think about it, and this is how I kind of think about it, is it is a lesson that you have to learn. So as you go through these stages while you're a child, you learn something. And then as you learn that thing, as that conflict is resolved, what happens is whatever the lesson is learned, that can hinder or help a person's development into adulthood. Now, if a certain issue is not resolved satisfactorily, a person may develop a kind of fixation. And these are, in essence, kind of a persistent focus on an earlier stage. And what happens is when someone is an adult and they have stressors presented to them, whatever that may be, rough day at work, or even like a high school student that, they have a test. Maybe they have test anxiety. Or, a little later, you're dealing with the IRS, or do you get that promotion? Do you not get that promotion? All these different stressors that show up. What happens is if a person has a fixation, when those stressors show up, when those anxieties show up, that can cause a person to kind of regress to those behaviors. So first off, you have the oral stage. Now the oral stage is when when you pop out of your mama's womb, covered in cottage cheese and placenta, and just from 0 to 1 years old, roughly. And what happens is here, the baby's libido is centered around mouth and activities such as eating and tasting. So kind of think about it this way. You have a small baby. They're helpless. That's really what it is. They are helpless, and the number one thing for any of us is, we need food and drink. If we don't eat, we starve to death. If we don't drink anything, we dehydrate and die. There's a lot of death in life. But so when you're a small child, from 0 to 1, you are completely dependent on your caretakers. And what happens is really this. That child, they develop trust based on their interactions with their caretakers. So if their caretakers are trustworthy, that child will develop a sense of trust. If a child's caretakers are negligent, that child will develop for lack of a better term, a lack of trust in their caretakers. Now what happens is kind of the conflict, and this is during the weaning process, when that child is not being breastfed anymore. Maybe they're starting to move on to solid foods, stuff like that. But what is happening though in that moment for that child is when they're in that weaning stage, what they're having to do is learn to not be so reliant on other people. Start, in essence, in a weird way, start taking responsibility for their own life. I know it sounds kind of extreme, but again, this is a process. So kind of the first step. Okay, maybe little Timmy holds his own bottle while he drinks it for the first time. Maybe he, starts, picking up the peas himself and eats them, and the little baby carrots, and starts trying to eat those as well. So it's a small step, but it's a very, very crucial step. And what can happen, depending on the parents, is they can develop in one of two ways. If parents and caretakers are pretty much overly accommodating, that child may actually develop a dependency. If that caretakers are negligent, that child may develop more aggression. And certain behaviors that can emerge from all this, behaviors, especially if there's a fixation. So little Timmy, who's 0 to 1, now he's an adult. Maybe he had parents that were overly needy overly giving or overly negligent. What can happen is those certain behaviors that can emerge from this is people that are, drinkers, stress eaters, nail biters, people who smoke. Because ultimately what happens is, really kind of this. Timmy has has a fixation. He grows up, becomes an adult, stress asserts himself, rough day at work. Okay, he stops by the bar, has a bit of cerveza. Or stress eating. You know what you need to do. but you don't want to for some reason, or it seems very stressful, so you grab a Hershey bar or you grab a Snickers bar, or again, smoking, nail biting, all those sorts of things. But ultimately, this is because of a stressor that has asserted itself that, and I'll talk about this a little later, causes the person to regress to a earlier stage of coping with that stress. The anal stage, this is around 1 to 3. And kind of the outward sign of all this is the child is learning to control their bowel, their bladder, their bowel movements. In essence, potty training. Now, what's happening for the child is really this. Because again, this is around, again, terrible twos, the trying threes, those fun times to be a parent, where your child has gone from being cute to now being a horrible little demon. And what is happening for the child is this. When they were in the oral stage, literally the world revolved around them. Now what's happening is the child is crawling, moving around, becoming more autonomous, and they're starting to explore the world a little bit. Now what's happening is that child is doing one of two things. One, they're trying to kill themselves all the time because now they're going, ooh, what is this hole in the wall? These 3 holes in the wall. Let me stick my fingers in them and, kill myself via electrocution. Or what can I do to dive off the bed and land face first on the ground? What's going to happen? So the child is exploring, and the child is learning that there's certain barriers. There's things that you do not want to do. There are consequences to their actions. Parents step in and they start saying no all the time. A little bit of side note, most children's first word is actually no, because parents are always telling them no. No, don't eat the dog's ear. No, get that Lego out of your mouth. No, get your fingers out of the wall. No, 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 don't kill yourself. So potty training them is kind of that one time where that child is, well, it's kind of that one moment where that child has a certain responsibility to control their bodily functions, not pee pee and poo poo in their pants anymore, but go to a toilet. They are becoming responsible for that, and they have to learn to control those things. So parents, why being parents is one of the hardest jobs in the world, you got to train your kid. And this can be a positive experience or a negative experience for the child. So what can happen is if a parent is too lenient with it, that child can develop into a messy, wasteful, destructive type personality. If a parent is too harsh, what can happen is that child can grow up to become stringent, orderly, very rigid. Anal retentive is a word that usually pops up to describe these kinds of adults. So this is kind of where you begin to see how that child is learning to interact with the world. So the oral stage, the child is learning, can I rely on my parents and by extension everybody else? The anal stage, the child is learning, okay, what are the barriers in life? What are the kind of the guardrails that keep me from totally derailing myself? And again, depending on what the child learns at this point, they can either become the 2 extremes, the perfect rule follower or the anti-rule follower. And ideally, somewhere in the middle is where you kind of want to be. I guess in the perfect happy world with sunshine and rainbows and bunnies. So then, once your child is done with the anal stage, they move into the phallic stage. And this is the part that kind of makes people very uncomfortable with this, because a lot of people, they kind of hear this and they go, oh, children become sexual creatures. Not quite. It's really more children become aware of the sexual differences of boys and girls. That does not necessarily mean they know how the plumbing works. Really what it is, it's kind of like more of like a societal thing. Little boys play with certain kinds of toys. Little girls play with certain kinds of toys in general. And what can happen also is when children become aware of what boys are, what girls are, again, and how they relate to each other, what happens is, they notice mommy and daddy, or a boy and a girl, and they're different. So in essence, they kind of understand the basic idea: opposites attract. Now, what can happen is what Freud called the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. And the Oedipus complex you find in boys is also where they have, castration anxiety. And pretty much the Oedipus complex is this: boy tries to replace daddy in a weird way. Um, Usually you will see this in the manifestation of the mama's boy. That's really kind of what it is. Boy wants to be with mommy, and they will try to, in a weird way, try to push out the dad a little bit for the mother's attention. And girls, you can see this in kind of the similar way: daddy's girl. Or even sometimes you can see this in tomboy behavior. And I think the main thing with the Electra complex, or penis envy, what Freud called it, was really kind of this. Um, they just want to, and I think this is more like a societal thing. Girls girls realize that there's certain things boys do that girls don't. So that can even manifest in tomboy behavior, where they want to, in essence, kind of explore that a little bit and see what it's like. Because again, it's one of those things where it's like, no, little Susie, no, you don't play with dolls, or you play with dolls. You don't go rolling around in the mud with all the other people and all the other kids. Well, what's going to happen if you tell somebody no? They're just going to want to do that even more. So I think that's something that's kind of factored up into this as well. But ultimately, what happens is all of this is ultimately resolved through some form of identification. And what happens is the child, what they will do is they will begin to mimic the behaviors of the same sex parent. So little boys, they will try to act like daddy. Little girls will try to act like mommy. And what they will do then is kind of use them as a role model and try to act like them. And this is actually one of the reasons why you will see children. You'll see a kid, you'll look at their parent, and you'll be like, yeah, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. For good or for bad. It just kind of just depends. So then you have the latency stage, and this is pretty much 5 to 6 to puberty. And this is where all the sexual energy is repressed or dormant. And what happens is the child is learning, in essence, to one, interact with other kids their age. So they're moving away from the family and kind of, they're going to school and they're hanging out with other kids and they're learning from each other. And they're developing the social and the communication skills to interact in society and build self-confidence. And you see, again, little Timmy will, they'll take up a hobby. Maybe they'll start playing baseball or something because that's what all the other boys are doing. Or, they'll develop those little hobbies and they'll play games or they'll do whatever. But really, the main thing about all this is the child at this time is learning to interact in society. And this is where other people like Jean Piaget step in, and even to a certain extent, Kohlberg, who talked about moral development. All these people kind of step in and kind of fill in this kind of stuff because this part is kind of vague. But the fixation here is really this: when that child is not able to grow up, because sometimes what can happen for whatever reason. Um, there's an inability for that child to eventually grow up. Because again, there's certain times where, yeah, you'll see that little kid and they'll start kind of in a weird way putting away their toys. Um, if you watch, what is it? One of the Toy Story movie. I think it was the second Toy Story movie. It was the scene where it was the song where the girl doll was talking about, you know, her kid. Um, Started growing up and she had the toy cowgirl doll, but eventually that doll went under the bed and all the cowgirl stuff went away and made way for like beauty stuff. That's actually a normal stage for people to go through. And boys, they go through the same stage as well. But it's kind of where they begin to put away their childish things. And again, it's not a drastic thing. It's like one or two things here or there. And that child is kind of sort of trying to act like an adult, but sometimes it's obvious and somewhat cringy. And then you have the genital stage. This is when you hit puberty and it lasts for the rest of your life. And what happens is really this: sexual feelings reemerge, but what happens is they're focused outside of the family. So this is where you'll see the teenagers, they'll start bristling under the authority of their parents or, all that kind of stuff. And also, they begin to start looking for a relationship, someone outside of the family, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, later, eventually, husband or wife. And, but kind of the main thing is it's all focused outside of the family. And what happens though, if the other four stages are completed successfully, the individual will be well balanced. And the balance is really this: they balance their personal needs with the need to conform to kind of society and, in essence, what other people expect of us. Because again, you get married to someone, that person is going to have expectations of you, even if those expectations are things you don't necessarily realize. Or you go to a job. You apply for a job, there's a list of expectations that they have for you. Sometimes they're written, sometimes they're not, and you have to learn on the job. In essence, you have to conform to those things. So that's really the balance. Now, what happens to get in the way of this is any other fixation from a lower level or from an earlier stage can emerge here. So, like for example, someone that is anal stage, their parents were too nice. They let the kid kind of get away with too much or whatever. That kid grows up anal retentive. And what can happen is that kid, now they're an adult, they're now trying to get a job. They get a job, their manager starts, telling them to do stuff, or they start offering criticism. How would somebody who's anal retentive respond in that way? Usually by maybe blowing up at their boss, yelling at him, and quitting on the spot. Someone that was whose parents were too attentive in the oral stage, they grow up very, very trusting to the point of being naive. They enter the genital stage, they're in competition with other people. They don't realize that, yeah, there's people that may be malevolent out there who want to derail them, who want to hurt them. Why? Because they're just jerks and bullies and those sorts of things. So those sorts of people can, retreat to stress eating, like when they get bullied or something like that. So this is really kind of the balance. And those other fixations, they can emerge and hinder or help people or usually hurt when they're in this stage. Now, to kind of wrap all this up a little bit though. So here's the thing with Freud. Freud, in essence, was the first guy to come along with an all-encompassing theory of personality. Before Freud, people had theories of personality, but it was kind of like a hit or miss thing. It was like this point, or this point, or this point, or this thing, or that thing. Freud was the first one to say, hey, here's my idea. This is all encompassing. Now, critics of Freud's ideas have said that his ideas are too complex to actually be able to test. And to a certain extent, that's true. And a lot of people, a lot of psychologists, they don't really use this in a clinical sense, but it is discussed and debated and used in a sense as kind of a model. And kind of like a guide when it comes to raising your children. Because again, it's one of those things where Freud, so much of his ideas were so accepted, we don't really think about it. So, like for example, you have a kid who's 1 to 3. Ultimately, what are you trying to raise them? You're trying to raise them, so that way, they follow the rule, they have a little bit of self-control. That's what you're trying to do at that stage. But ultimately, and this is kind of the thing with Freud, what is a parent's responsibility or a caretaker's responsibility? What you're doing is you're raising a child to be socially acceptable to society, so they can play with society, and at the same time, they can be independent enough to stand for themselves and not just change their middle name to Welcome and allow everybody to just walk all over them. And so, and again, to kind of wrap all this up, lastly, stressors that are experienced in life can cause someone to regress to behaviors associated with a different stage. So, again, people that deal with a lot of stress, they're that type A personality. They like everything kind of ordered, those sorts of things. The kind of person where like if something bad happens, the first thing they do is they organize their desk because they can control that. Other people that are, chronic gum chewers or nail biters or stuff like that when they deal with anxiety, someone that's stuck in that oral stage. Or even things like in the phallic stage where they get so focused on themselves, they want to be the center of attention. They're, look at me, I am the center of everything. So, I've seen this as a teacher where I have kids that will, in essence, want to be the center of attention. Not because they have anything to add or anything, they just want to be acknowledged. And that's, again, a result of a fixation at that stage in their development. So I'll just leave it there because, again, this is kind of the idea with Freud. Freud was the first guy to come along and try to explain this. And again, some of his ideas we've accepted and we understand it. Other things, even with the use of his vocab, does not necessarily jive with a bit of our modern understanding. So it's kind of important. Whenever you're looking at Freud, take him for what he is. He was the first guy to try to explain stuff, and he was, again, a product of his time. Because again, late 1800s, early 1900s was his time frame. And there was a lot of things that they, in essence, did not understand yet. And, they didn't have microscopes and those sorts of things. And a lot of other people, they come along and they refine Freud's ideas or build off of them and other things as well. But again, it's good to understand that Freud, he kind of just got the ball rolling. And other people came and built off of his ideas and refined them and made them better. So, I will leave it there. I'm out.